Alrighty, well, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning. Welcome to the Apologetics Track Workshop on Thinking Biblically. My name is Roy Swart. In my day job, I'm an engineer at Intel. I've worked there since 1997, so if you do the math, that's a long time, maybe longer than some of you have been alive. But my other passion is being a husband and a father. So my wife and I have 7 kids, and we used to homeschool all of them. So this is what our picture of our family looks like. Now be honest, you're like, I really did think that was true, because if 7 kids and you homeschool, this is usually the picture that people think of. Yeah, you churn your own butter, you make your own clothes. No, this is a picture of us for real. Just a normal family that likes to have fun and enjoy life. The reason I brought up my family and homeschooling is because I want to share a quick little story about how we started homeschooling that's going to feed into today's talk. So many years ago, when our oldest was like 7 years old, we moved out into the woods in a mountain at the end of a dirt road. So in the middle of nowhere. We had 3 kids who were school age, and they all had different school schedules. And we had a Suburban at the time, and it got like 4 miles to the gallon. And my wife used to drive to and from town, 3 different school schedules. And so we were putting like 300 miles a week on a Suburban at 4 miles per gallon. We were going to have to take a second mortgage on the house just to pay for gas. And I was like, this is crazy. Like, this is not sustainable. And so my wife has a degree in early childhood education. We'd never even heard of homeschooling. I'm a first-generation Christian, so I went to public school. I wasn't a Christian until later. And so I was like, why don't we just school the kids at home? We'll call it school at home. And she's like, all right, cool, let's do that. So that's how we started homeschooling. We didn't even know that there was a homeschooling thing. What was fascinating was I went to a very technical college. I've been in math and science and engineering my whole life. But it wasn't until I started homeschooling my own kids that I was like, I don't really know how to explain concepts to people very well. And I started thinking about how I think, and I was like, I don't think very well. I don't think very consistently. I make a bunch of presuppositions in the beginning of my thinking that I can't justify, and then I manipulate the facts in order to reach the conclusions that I've already presupposed. And I'm like, what in the world am I doing? And so as I was homeschooling my kids, I ended up unschooling myself. And so a lot about what we're going to be talking about today is my own personal journey of how I began to think biblically. So the first, the verse that's going to anchor us today is Romans 12, verse 2. So let me just start with that. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person. Maybe you guys never saw this before. What's one of the ways that God uses to transform us into a new person? By changing the way you think. So let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. And so a lot of the Christian walk is experiencing God. A lot of the Christian walk is obeying God's commands. But a lot of the Christian walk is also changing the way that you think. And so maybe some of you haven't had that false foundation built already that you have to tear down. I did. It took me years to undo all the false foundation and then rebuild a biblically thinking foundation. So really the question today that we're going to talk about is, what does it mean to think biblically? It's a super simple question, and pretty much this whole talk is going to be asking that one question and then discussing the answer. And we could just jump straight to the end and do that. But I don't think we're going to have a productive conversation. So I'm going to take about 30 minutes to define terms and set the context so we can come back to this one question. But I wanted to show you a roadmap. This entire the next 30 minutes, we're going to be defining terms, thinking together, and then we're going to come back to this one question, and that's the whole talk. So let me start with truth. And let me ask you a question. If you wanted to learn something, how would you do it? If you wanted to learn something today, so if you wanted to learn what the fastest accelerating car in the world is, or you wanted to know what phone takes the best pictures, how would you do it?
Read about it.
Read where?
Books, on articles.
Okay.
Study the information so you can put it in your head.
Okay, you'd go read about it.
The internet or YouTube.
Yeah, Google it, YouTube. Great. What about if you wanted to know how to throw a perfect spiral with a football, or how to braid your hair? Let's say you're like, I want to do a fishtail, waterfall, French braid, Dutch braid. Now you know I have 5 daughters. How would you learn that kind of thing? Yes? Okay, so you'd ask someone. Good. That my younger daughters were like, I'd ask my older sister.
You would just go do it. Like, just go practice.
You just go do it. Okay, good. Do you think if, like, let's say you asked your older sister, how do you do a Dutch braid, and she told you, do you think you'd be like, sweet, I know it, I'm an expert, I could just go do it? Or do you think you'd have to try it at first yourself?
I'm not sure.
Again, my younger daughters were like, it took me like, I had to practice on my Barbies for like hours. Even after I knew how to do it, I had to practice and learn it myself. The point there is, I think there are 2 ways that we can learn something. One, like you guys said, you can learn it from someone else. This is Google, read a book. Or you can figure it out yourself. Learn it from someone else or figure it out yourself. So let me give you an example. Who here knows what the capital of Scotland is?
Is it
Edinburgh.
Edinburgh?
Yep. So I've been there. Here's a picture of Edinburgh. That's how they'd say it there. Edinburgh. Edinburgh. That's how they'd say it over there. So I've been there. This is a picture. I've stood on that wall. I've been to the cathedral and the chapels there. So I knew that Edinburgh was the capital of Scotland because I was there. Were you there?
No.
So how did I learn it?
Going.
Yeah, I learned it by doing it myself. What was your name? But we'll skip that. So how did you learn it?
Google Maps.
So I learned it one way, the figured out myself way, and he learned it the read it from someone else, learn it from someone else way. So actually, most of what you learn, if you think about it, you actually don't learn it yourself. You read it or you learn it from someone else, and then you trust that person. That's an important thing. So let's walk through both of these with some examples. Let's take the learn it from someone else method first. Number 1, you start with an assumption, an initial truth. And as we talked about, that's from a trusted resource. So a book, it seems more trustworthy to have a book that somebody published and you read it there. That has a certain amount of credibility or authority. Sometimes the internet, sometimes it's credible, sometimes it's just, some weird post or whatever. So you're looking for some trusted resource. I'm going to call that introduce a new word here, a revelation. Somebody who knows reveals to you something that you will learn for yourself. Number 2, you follow that with a correct observation. You look around yourself and you're like, I'm going to see if that's really true. Like I could have read a book about Edinburgh being the capital of Scotland, but then when I went there and I'm like, I don't see any evidence that this is really true. So you follow it with a correct observation. And when I mean correct, I want to emphasize the word correct. So who here thinks they're good at observing? Come on, everybody, right? You guys, if you see stuff, you're like, I'm a pretty good observer, right? So if I told you something that was true or not true, you think you're like, okay, I could tell, I could look at something and see if that was true or not. Let's test you on this. Ready? I want everybody to look at this screen, know everything about this picture, okay? And then I'm going to ask you a question. If you're good observers, you ought to know, right? So memorize this screen. Now here's a second screen. Now you guys are all good observers, so let me ask you a question. Did the number of puppies increase or decrease?
It stayed the same.
Okay, there's a vote for stayed the same. Would you bet $100 on that? So maybe he's not too sure of himself. What about anybody else?
I'd say it stayed the same.
Stayed the same? Okay. How about the number of kittens? Did they increase or decrease? They decreased? Stayed the same? Isn't it interesting that even something that I said, I told you, I'm going to test your observation, and we looked at it for a while. None of you seem super sure about whether they decreased or increased or stayed the same. So sometimes it's hard to make an observation. It's hard to make a correct observation. So by the way, one of my daughters is an absolute dog fanatic, and the other one is an absolute cat fanatic. So both of them increased, because you can never have enough cute puppies and dogs. All right, so follow with a correct observation, and then step number 3, follow consistent logic. And what do I mean by that? Not like crazy, even though we're in a college classroom, I don't mean sophisticated college logic. I mean common sense. Anybody can do step number 3. It's just common sense. It's the stuff that you learned in the 3rd grade. Who here has passed the 3rd grade? Okay, perfect. So all of you ought to be able to do this. So if I said to you, I'm a person and I'm a tree, what would your 3rd grade brain say? No. That's what I mean by consistent logic. This isn't complicated. You're just like, you can't be a person and a tree. That's not possible. Okay, so if you do those 3 things correctly, you get an additional truth. You started with an initial truth, and you get an additional truth. Well, let me walk you through. Okay, we're making an observation. So this is the context. We're going to start with an initial truth. All people are created in the image of God. Could you tell that just by yourself, by looking at those people? No, somebody had to reveal that to you. Who revealed that to us? God, through the Bible, right? Okay, so we're going to call that a revelation. Now let's make an observation. There's your people. Let's make an observation. Let's pick one of them. Socrates. Socrates is a person. That's an observation, and it's a correct observation. Now let's use consistent logic. If all people are created in the image of God, and Socrates is a person, what's our conclusion?
All people are persons. Then he was made in the
Socrates is created.
There we go. Our conclusions, that's true also, but Socrates is created in the image of God. Okay, that's our additional truth. So when Socrates looks at himself in the mirror, I don't know if they had mirrors back then, I think they did, he's going to see what? Someone who's created in the image of God. Perfect. That's how it works. So let's walk this through. You start with an assumption that's true. Next, you have an observation that's correct. Next, you have logic that is consistent. Then your conclusion, if you follow those steps, your conclusion must be right. Okay? And what do you get? an additional truth. Now, what happens if we do the opposite? What if we start with an assumption that's false, and then we have an observation that's not correct, and then we use logic that's not consistent? Is our conclusion going to be right? No, our conclusion is going to be wrong. If we have wrong conclusions, do we get an additional truth? No. What do we get? I'm going to call it useless nonsense. We just get nothing, garbledygook, right? Now let me test your understanding here. Let's say that we start with an assumption that's true, and we have an observation that is correct. So number one's right, number two's right. But then our third step, our logic is inconsistent. Is our conclusion right or wrong?
Could be either way.
Could be, but probably our conclusion's going to, we might get lucky and tie ourselves up and do a double negative, but our conclusion is probably going to be wrong if our logic is inconsistent. What do you get? Useless nonsense. Now, what if we start with an assumption that's true, but that we make an observation that's not correct? But then we come back and then we use consistent logic from then. Our conclusion is going to be wrong because our observation was incorrect. And we'll go through an example on this, okay? You get useless nonsense. What if we start with a false assumption in the very beginning, but then from then on we have correct observations and consistent logic? We're still wrong. And we'll walk through an example of this. And we get useless nonsense. Okay, so the point there is, there are lots of different ways you can mix and match. You might do one thing right, or two things right, or three things right, but if you ever do anything wrong, your conclusion is wrong. You get useless nonsense. There's only one way to get an additional truth, and that's to follow all these things, to follow the method accurately. So let's start with a quiz. Let me test you with a quiz, and we'll see what this looks like. Are cats created in the, remember the cute kittens? Are cats created in the image of God? Well, let's walk through the thing. What's our initial assumption? All people are created in the image of God. Is that true or false? True. Then we said a cat's a person. Is that true? No. Do you think a cat looks like a person? No, a cat's not a person. So our observation was not correct. We were like, okay, we know that if they're a person, they're created in the image of God. And then we look at a cat and we say, that cat, I think, is a person. We make an incorrect observation. Let's use a little more sophisticated, complicated question, okay? If God is love, whoa, maybe that was God. If God is love, something is going on. If God is love, why doesn't he let people love who they want to love? Well, let's start with our assumptions. Let's go through this one at a time. If God is love, how do we know if God is love or not? The Bible. So can you think of a Bible verse that says God is love?
I'm just curious.
Yeah.
How does he not let us love who we want to love?
That's the second part. Let's do it step at a time. We'll get there. If God is love, Bible verse for God is love. Anybody? First John. Yes, 1 John 4:16. Yep. I'll just shorten it because that's all I could fit on the screen. God is love, and all who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. So if the question says, if God is love, we're like, well, we know he's love, so we can check that off. Then we go back and say, well, wait a minute. Then why wouldn't he let people love who they want to love? And in the context, kind of a hot topic in our culture today with LGB is like, hey, anybody ought to be able to love whoever they want to love. So why is God against that? If God really is love, why is he against that? What is the implied assumption in that statement? There's an implied assumption.
The definition of love?
Yeah, what's the definition of love? Is the definition... Well, God is love. The implied assumption is true love would always allow the beloved to do whatever they want. So let's think about that. Let's say I loved you and I saw you just about ready to jump off a cliff. Would the loving thing to be, all right, Andrew, jump off a cliff, whatever. Would that be the loving thing? No. What if I loved my man Jim there behind the camera and I saw him just about ready to drink? He thought it was a cup of coffee, but it was really a cup of poison. Would I be like, if Jim's like, hey, if you love me, you just let me do whatever I wanted to do. I want to drink poison. Would that be loving? No. So the loving thing to do is not to always let somebody do whatever they want to do. It's to let them do whatever's good for them. So, did you guys know that there's a Bible verse that says every single thing God commands, all of his rules, are bad for us or good for us? Good. Are good for us. Deuteronomy 6:24. This is when Moses is explaining all the law to Israel, and he's like, and the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, everything that God commands, all of his rules, to fear the Lord our God for our good always. So, what was the assumption embedded in this question? Is God really love? Yes, so that assumption was true. What was the second assumption embedded in the language of this question? If you love someone, you always allow them to do whatever they want to do. Is that assumption true? No. So you go back and you say, I started with a false assumption. And then I might make correct observations. And I might say, people who are attracted to the same sex, those are people. Great. So then God loves them. Yes, those are correct observations. That's consistent logic. But you made an assumption in the very beginning that was false. The assumption in the very beginning that was false was true love allows people to do whatever they want to do. Once you start with that false assumption, you can never recover. You never undo that false assumption. All right, so that was the learn it from someone else method. Now let's talk about the other one, figure it out yourself method. It starts very similarly. Instead of starting with the truth, or it includes something very similar, it includes correct observations. So you need to make correct observations. That's the consistent thing between the two methods. Then you follow with additional correct observations. Keep looking and looking and looking. And then third, it's the same thing, follow consistent logic. So let's walk through an illustration with this. There's our same group of guys. So let's pick one, okay? Socrates is a person. It's the same observation that we had with the other one, right? Okay, now let's keep watching Socrates. You're going to have to watch this carefully. Blech. What just happened? What was your observation? Socrates died. So your observation was he died. Was that a correct observation? Yeah. In this, we didn't really see him die, but we saw it on the screen. So, okay, great. Now let's come up with another observation. Pick another guy in this thing. Plato. Okay, Plato is a person. Is that a correct observation? Yes. Blech. What happened to Plato? He died. So our next observation, which is our second correct observation, is Plato's a person. He died. Pick another guy up there. Aristotle. Aristotle is a person because he's in that group. Blech. What happened to Aristotle? He died. So if you walk through this simple illustration using consistent logic, Every person that we picked out of that group did what? Died. So our consistent logic, our conclusion would be all people die. Everybody that I saw died. Okay, great. So our conclusion is all people will die. That's a lot of people. All right? So in our first method, what did we end with? If we followed our first method correctly, what did we end with? Do you guys remember? An additional truth. We started with an initial truth, and then we ended with an additional truth. Now, what if we had not followed it correctly? Remember that little table I showed? If we didn't follow the method, what did we get? Useless nonsense. Okay? Now let's talk about figure it out for yourself. So that's the first method. Now the second method, figure it out yourself. If we follow it correctly, what do we get? A truth, maybe? If we follow this, if we make an observation and it's correct, we make additional observations, they're correct, we apply consistent logic, we end with
the confirmation of the observation.
Okay, let's walk it through. Let's go back to our illustration. Remember, we had a group of guys. We picked somebody. Socrates, he's a person. We made an observation. Blah. What happened? He died. So let's pick another guy. Let's pick another guy out of this group. We already picked Plato. We already picked Socrates. We already picked Aristotle. Let's pick the guy in the back. Elijah. Is Elijah a person? Okay. Blah. Oops. Wait a minute. What happened to Elijah? Elijah did not die. That's our observation. If we'd have been there, that's our observation. Is that a correct observation? Yeah, he didn't die. Elijah never died. That's a correct observation. Now, what does that do to our conclusion? We watched all these people die. Thousands, millions, tens of millions, or whatever. And we were like, we got it. All people die. What is that? What does one contradictory observation do to our conclusion? Yeah, but what does it do to this exact conclusion? All people will die. Makes it not true. It's false. So, it only takes one contradictory, correct observation to make your conclusion wrong. So, what we found now is a falsehood. We found I'm going to call it a not truth. Okay, so if all of our observations line up, maybe we get a truth. But if we have one contradictory observation, we get a not truth. But hold on a second. Do we really get a truth? If all of our observations line up, do we really get a truth like we did in the first example, where we had a revelation and then we got an additional truth? Let me think about it. Or let's think about it together. Have you guys ever been to the carnival and you hit the thing and it goes ding, it goes all the way up? Okay. So this method, the figure it out yourself method, has a scale, a likelihood between false and true. Okay? So our confidence goes up as the number of consistent observations goes up. But it only takes one contradictory observation to destroy the entire hypothesis, to take us all the way back to zero. Not just go down, but all the way back to zero. So let's say that we had 1, 2, 3, 100 consistent observations. We're like, hey, the likelihood of this being true is starting to edge up. What if we went to 10,000 consistent observations? Our likelihood continues to go up. What if we went to 1,000,000 consistent observations? It goes up. But at some point, you reach a maximum level of confidence that's possible from this method. You never get all the way to the top. What I'm going to say is, the best you can ever do is you can say it's probable truth. So, what's the end of this? Is it truth and not truth? No. It's probable or not truth. Yeah, some of you are like, wait a minute, hold on, I got to figure this out. I need to work all this out. So let me introduce one of my favorite topics. As I said, I went to school to study engineering. I've worked in the realm, the field of science and engineering for almost 30 years. My favorite topic in the world is science. How is science portrayed in terms of its ability to prove truth? Good, right? They're like, if somebody's like, well, the science says, then you're like, okay, well, if the science says, then it's got to be true, right? That's how it's portrayed? Okay, let's think about that. Which of these methods is science? Is it the left one or the right one? But the right one says only probable. Now, do you guys remember what science is? Let me give you a quick explanation. Science, you make an observation, then you make an educated guess to explain your observation called a hypothesis, and then you try and find the contradictory observation. In science, what you're actually trying to do, this is a subtle thing, a lot of people who aren't in it every single day, you're actually never trying to prove, you're always trying to disprove. You're setting up a hypothesis, and then you're trying to disprove your hypothesis. You had a question.
Well, it's like science isn't like you're going to come up to an answer because it's like ever going because like the scientific process is based off of comparing your results with other people's.
Yes. It's actually not quite comparing your results to other people's. It's comparing your results against your hypothesis. That's good. That's a great observation. You're right. It is forever. So let's walk through an illustration of what this looks like. I'm going to say science is like a bulldozer. Okay? So you're in there. And then your hypothesis is like a building. Okay? It's a possible truth. You don't know if it's going to be true or not. So you take your bulldozer, you go up to your hypothesis, your building, and you see if you can destroy your building. And if you can destroy your building, what do you have? A not truth. Okay, so that building wasn't strong enough. So let's say you build a better building. And then you take your bulldozer and you try and destroy that second building. And if you can destroy it, you have another not truth. And then you're like, I'm going to build a huge house. There's no way this bulldozer is going to be able to destroy it. And then you come and you whittle away, bomb, 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 and you destroy that truth. Then you have another not truth. But what if you build a ginormous, massive castle that you're like, this thing's never going to be taken down? Do you have an absolute truth? If your bulldozer can't knock down that castle, do you have an absolute truth? No, what do you have? A probable truth. Yeah. So you have a problem. So I anticipated that. So what did I get? Well, look, I got a bigger bulldozer. So, and that's exactly how science works. You build a bigger castle, you build a bigger bulldozer. You build a bigger castle, you build a bigger bulldozer. And it goes on and on and on. But the best you can ever do is maybe a probable truth because I haven't built a big enough bulldozer yet. So, which one of these is science? You're right, it's the one on the right. And a lot of people don't, it's certainly not the way that science is portrayed today. Science is like the bastion of absolute truth. The Bible, yeah, that's just myths. Christianity, that's all falsehood. Science, that's where you get absolute truth. It's actually, when you think about it, it's actually the opposite. So let me write down a couple of quick things about science if you're taking notes. Science, and we talked about these, but I wanted to put it on the screen. Science never proves anything. It can't. It's not designed to. It kills me. Article after article after article. Science has proved blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, no, it hasn't. No, it hasn't. And scientists will mistakenly, incorrectly, inaccurately say science has proved. Those scientists are actually not following their own scientific method. And again, I've been in science for 30 years. I've worked with thousands, tens of thousands of scientists all over the world. Many of them forget that science can't prove anything. The only thing it can do is disprove. So I'm going to introduce you to some specific language. The best science can ever do is a double negative, so it's a little tricky with your mind. The best it can do is fail to disprove. For now. That's the best science can ever do. So if someone's like, hey, science proved, you're like, no, it didn't. All it did was fail to disprove. That's not the same thing as proving. All right, let's go back to our question about truth. And we talked a little bit about this, but I just want to summarize. Which of these can yield truth? The left or the right? Only the left. The right can never create or produce or yield truth. It can produce probable truth, but it can never produce truth. The only thing that produces truth is the left method. And to get an additional truth, you need to start with what? An initial truth. I'm going to let that sink in for the rest of the weekend. But the big thing here is you never get truth unless you start with truth. But then you're like, wait a minute, hold on. How do I get truth in the first place? If I need truth to get more truth, then I'm like caught in a circular reasoning. I can never get more truth without starting with truth. So how do I start with truth?
Jesus.
Exactly. The Bible is how we start with our truth. And that's a whole nother, if I had another 2 hours, or another hour, we could walk through, well then how do we know that the Bible is true? And that's actually another talk that we've given. There's a lot of great resources. If you're like, I want to talk more about that, come to our booth in the gym, sometime later in the weekend. Come by and say, all right, you said that you would answer that question. How do we know the Bible is true? Because if you said we can't ever get more truth without starting with truth, and the only truth that we have is the Bible, then how do we get that? Haven't you contradicted yourself? I'd love to have that conversation with you. Okay, here is you guys remember the one question that I said we were going to try and do. How are we going to think biblically? Anytime you go to think about something, you start with the truth, which is in the Bible. So what does it mean to think biblically? It means to always go back to the Bible when you're thinking about something. So if you have a question about, hey, I wonder if cats are made in the image of God, you go back to the Bible. I wonder if it's okay for God to have rules against homosexuality. Is that okay? Is that even consistent with God? Go back to the Bible. If you have questions about, wait a minute, why would God command atrocities like the Canaanites to be killed? Go back to the Bible. So what it means to think biblically is it means to start with the Bible, understand what the Bible says about something, and then think from there. Let me end with 2 practical suggestions, and we might have time for a few questions. Number 1, use self-consistency as a signpost. So think of it like this. Finding truth can be like walking into a jungle. And you're like, man, it's super complicated, and I don't know where the truth is going to be. and then you walk, and you're on a path, and you find something, and you find a post that says 2 + 2 = 4. Do you think you're on the right path, or you think you're on the wrong path? Right path. Great. So you're like, good. That's a self-consistent thing. I know 2 + 2 is equal to 4. Great. That's a self-consistent thing. I'm using my common sense, my third grade logic. Now, let's say you go a little bit further down the path, and it says, a man is not the same thing as a woman. Is that consistent or not? Are you on the right path, or are you on the wrong path? You're on the right path. So you're like, great. I'm continuing to be on this path of self-consistency. Now, what if you go a little bit deeper into the forest, and you find a sign that says, everything came from nothing for no reason? Does that, like your third grade self, does that make sense? No. So you're like, I don't know where I made the wrong turn, but I'm going to try and go back to that other path and find more self-consistency. So that's the number one practical thing that you can do when you are searching for truth. See if the thing, the worldview, the construct that you're thinking about, does it contradict itself? Right? Nothing that contradicts itself is going to work. And every falsehood, every false worldview will end up contradicting itself at some point. Number 2, and this is the last one, and then we'll end. You never use things that are complex to judge things that are straightforward. If you know something and it's straightforward, and then you're thinking about something that's really complex, never use the complex thing as something to judge the straightforward thing. Let me give you an example. Let's say a guy walked into the optometrist with a pair of broken glasses. And he said, hey, I need you to fix these glasses. Would it make sense for the optometrist to put on a smudgy, broken pair of glasses to try and fix the glasses? No. What kind of glasses would you use? If you had a pair of broken glasses and maybe you didn't know how to fix them, what kind of glasses do you need to analyze the problem? Really good glasses, really clear glasses. So you would put on a really clear pair of glasses, and then you'd say, okay, now I'm going to try and look at these glasses that are broken and see if I can figure out what's wrong. So let me give you an example. Deuteronomy 32:4 says, God is perfect and all his judgments are right. Is that pretty clear? Okay. So is God perfect? Yeah. Are all his judgments right? Okay. So whatever he does is right. That's very clear and very straightforward. Now, you go to somewhere else in Deuteronomy and you're like, God told the Israelites to kill all the Canaanites who were sacrificing their children on the altar of Molech. Ew, that's complex. That's crazy. As you're thinking about that, if you get to a place you're like, oh, I know the answer. I know why God did that. Because he's not perfect. Because he's not just. Because his judgments are not right. Are you in the right place? No. You're like, wait a minute. I don't know where my logic, it was very complex. I don't know where I went sideways with my logic, but I just contradicted a very simple thing. So let me go back to that simple thing that I know is very clear, which is God is perfect and his judgments are right, and let me try and think about that again. All right. Let me end with this verse, and then if we have just a minute, I can take maybe 1 or 2 questions, but you're going to hand out the things. Let me end with this. Let me read Deuteronomy 23:19. God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? Where has God said, and where has God spoken to us today? How do we know what God has said and spoken? The Bible. And God says, I don't change. I'm perfect. I am who I am. And so everything that God has revealed to us in his word has got to be our starting point for everything. All right. Thank you.